Have you ever stopped to wonder if you'd have the courage to fight an enemy millions of times more powerful, even knowing that death was certain? Well, most would say no way, but that's exactly what Leonidas did, and in such a brutal way that to this day, his story is remembered as one of humanity's greatest acts of courage. Before we continue, tell me, have you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, take this opportunity to subscribe, like and comment on what you think of this story. It really helps in delivering this content to more people. The truth is, what Leonidas did wasn't just heroism. He made decisions that, at the time, seemed completely insane, but which changed the course of history. And we're not talking about clean battles or happy endings. We're talking about blood, sacrifice, and choices few would have the stomach for. That's precisely why this story continues to fascinate generations. But there's one detail that almost no one talks about. Behind the glory, there was strategy, there was coldness, and there was calculated brutality. Nothing that happened was by chance. And that's where things get really interesting. Because understanding Leonidas is understanding the true weight of extreme leadership. So come with me, because today you're going to discover the darkest and at the same time most inspiring side of a king who decided to challenge the impossible and change the world in the process. Leonidas didn't emerge in history by chance, and that's precisely the beauty of his destiny. In a Greece divided into city-states, each with its own culture and power, Sparta was a world apart. Imagine a place where life revolved around war, where honor was more valuable than existence itself. It was in this setting that Leonidas grew up, molded by a system that made every citizen a born soldier. And believe me, there was no room for weakness there. While Athens flourished with philosophy and art, Sparta went against the grain, producing disciplined and lethal warriors. From an early age, young Leonidas understood that living in Sparta meant fighting, obeying, and if necessary, dying for the collective. It's curious to think how such a rigid society could create a leader capable of inspiring generations, even centuries later. Perhaps that's precisely why his story still resonates so deeply with us, because it reveals the weight of irreversible choices. Leonidas was born at a time when the Persian Empire was expanding like a tidal wave, swallowing entire peoples. The Persians were by far the greatest power in the ancient world, with nearly infinite resources. Given this, any attempt at resistance seemed madness. But as we will see, it is precisely from madness that humanity's most memorable acts emerge. Who hasn't felt like they were facing something much greater than themselves? And when we talk about destiny, it's impossible not to think about how certain people seem to be born in the exact place and time to change the course of things. Leonidas, even though he wasn't the direct heir, ended up on the throne at the very moment his people most needed a worthy leader. But the most interesting thing is to realize that all this was just the beginning of a story that would be marked by blood, sacrifice, and brutality, and of course by decisions no one would have the courage to make lightly. Sparta wasn't just a city, it was practically a war machine. There, from birth, the fate of every child was ruthlessly decided. If deemed weak or incapable, they were left to die. Sounds cruel, right? But for them, this was how society was purified, ensuring that only the strongest survived. This logic shaped generations of warriors, and Leonidas was no exception. The famous agoge, the Spartan training system, began early, almost like a school, only for combat and pain resistance. Imagine a 7-year-old child being ripped from his family to learn to fight, hunt, and even survive on very little food. If you've ever heard someone say, "Life is hard, but it builds character," know that in Sparta this was taken to the extreme. They believed that only constant suffering could form unbeatable leaders and soldiers. It's interesting to consider how this shaped their mindset. While other Greek cities valued debate, art, and philosophy, Sparta cultivated silence, discipline, and blind obedience. It was as if everyone were part of a larger machine, in which individuality simply had no place. Leonidas, in this context, grew up, understanding that the I mattered less than the we, and this vision, as harsh as it may seem, was crucial to the decisions he would make later. But do you know what's most curious? Despite all this brutality, there was a certain pride in belonging to Sparta. The young men who survived the agoge carried with them an unshakable confidence, almost as if they were invincible, and this, of course, helped to create warriors capable of impossible feats. After all, when someone endures so much pain and humiliation from an early age, facing a colossal enemy seems like just another challenge on the list, doesn't it? Leonidas grew up in a reality that would be unthinkable for any child today. From an early age, he was subjected to brutal tests to prove his strength and endurance. There was no pampering, no comfort. There was discipline, pain, and overcoming. If a Spartan child complained too much or showed fear, they were seen as weak, and this was practically a social death sentence. It was life, raw and cruel, with no room for mercy. At Agorge, young Leonidas learned to survive on the bare minimum. He went hungry, cold, and had to steal food to survive. But if caught, the punishment was severe. Curious, right? Theft wasn't punished, but getting caught was. This shows how they trained not only warriors, but also cunning people, capable of thinking under pressure. It's even comparable to those situations in which we have to make do in adulthood, bills to pay, problems at work, only of course, on an infinitely crueler scale. Another notable feature was the practice of the cryptae, in which young Spartans were sent to hunt and kill helots, state slaves, as a form of training and intimidation. It was a bloody rite that reinforced the coldness and brutality required to be a true hoplite. Leonidas's childhood was a reflection of this society, hardened by violence, but forged to lead and inspire. And that's where the story begins to take on an even more intense tone. Because deep down, all this extreme preparation had no other purpose than to create men willing to do the impossible for Sparta. The mindset he had carried since childhood would become crucial when the Persian threat loomed on the horizon, and the decisions that followed would show how dearly he would pay for having been raised this way. Leonidas's path to the throne was anything but straightforward. He wasn't the direct heir, but rather the third son of King Anaxandrides II. In a society as rigid as Sparta, this meant he would only have a real chance of ruling if fate played its part. And lo and behold, fate did. With the death of his older brothers, Leonidas ended up inheriting the crown, almost as if he were being silently prepared for that decisive moment. Upon assuming the throne, Leonidas immediately demonstrated that he would be no ordinary king. He possessed the demeanor of someone who had lived the reality of the people and knew firsthand what it meant to be a Spartan. Unlike many leaders who grew up surrounded by luxury and power, he knew pain, discipline, and the value of sacrifice. Perhaps that's why he earned respect so quickly, something essential in a city where strength mattered more than any title. His marriage to Gorgo, daughter of Leonidas I, was not only a romantic choice, but also a strategic one. Gorgo was known for her intelligence and political influence, and together they formed one of the most powerful couples in ancient Greece. It's curious how, to this day, we still underestimate the role of women in history, isn't it? Gorgo wasn't a decorative queen. She advised Leonidas at key moments, proving that leadership is also built through clever alliances. Little did he know that, by assuming that position, his destiny was sealed to face the greatest challenge Sparta, and perhaps all of Greece, had ever faced. The shadows of a colossal empire loomed, and soon Leonidas would have to decide between protecting his own life or going down in history as a symbol of courage and sacrifice. When Leonidas assumed the throne, the world was already changing rapidly. The Persian Empire, led by Darius I and later Xerxes I, was growing like a devastating wave, swallowing up entire territories and peoples. The threat was impossible to ignore. Sooner or later, Greece would fall prey to this colossal power. And let's face it, facing such a vast empire seemed more like a death sentence than a strategic decision. But that's precisely where the story gets interesting. The Persians weren't just numerous, they had nearly infinite resources. Their armies were gigantic, their fleet immense, and their territory seemed unconquerable. To any ordinary Greek, the idea of confronting them bordered on madness. But Leonidas saw beyond that. He knew that if no one acted, Greek freedom would be crushed. And in moments like these, it's always the bold minority that makes the difference. Who hasn't been in a situation where it seemed impossible to win, but decided to try anyway? It was in this context that alliances, debates, and tensions began between the Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, historic rivals, had to swallow their pride and unite against a common enemy. Leonidas, with his direct and straightforward manner, became a key player in this unlikely union. After all, courage without strategy is mere folly, and he knew this better than anyone. With every step, it became clear that Leonidas's fate was intertwined with something much greater than himself. The world was heading toward an epic confrontation, and the Spartan king would have to prove, in practice, that he was the right man to lead the resistance. And of course, the decisions he would make next would be as brutal as they were necessary. When it became clear that confrontation with the Persians was inevitable, Leonidas made a decision that is still remembered today as an act of extreme courage or complete folly, depending on your perspective. He chose only 300 warriors to march with him to Thermopylae, but these weren't just any 300. Each of them had one thing in common: they already had sons to ensure the continuation of their families. This alone shows how much the mission was seen as a path of no return. These men were handpicked, not only for their combat ability, but also for their strength of character and loyalty. After all, who would be willing to follow the king on a mission that was practically suicidal? Leonidas knew that morals were as important as the sword, and so, before leaving, he made a point of demonstrating that he wasn't there to save his own skin, but rather to set an example. It's that old adage, true leaders don't send anyone where they don't have the courage to go. The preparations were not only physical, but also emotional. Imagine the scene: warriors saying goodbye to their families, knowing they would probably never return. Historians say that instead of tears, there was pride in their eyes. This is because, in Sparta, dying for the common good was the greatest glory possible. To us today, it seems inconceivable, but for them, it was like signing a contract with their own honor. And as they departed, Leonidas carried with him a mammoth burden. He knew he wouldn't return alive, but he was fully aware that this battle could change the course of history. And curiously, it was this go-all-the-way mentality that made the Spartan king a living legend, and that would pave the way for the most brutal moments to come. If there was one thing that set the Spartans apart from any other army of the time, it was their almost inhuman discipline. They didn't fight as isolated warriors. They were like a perfect machine, working in sync. Their famous phalanx formation, a wall of shields and spears, turned every battle into a veritable massacre for anyone who dared face them head-on. It was strength, strategy, and coolness in their purest form. Leonidas knew that discipline was his greatest weapon against the onslaught of Persian soldiers. While the enemy relied on numbers, he relied on precision. In Sparta, each soldier knew exactly what to do, as if a reflection of the other. This culture of absolute obedience was so profound that even in the face of death, warriors maintained their formation. It's remarkable to think how, even today, elite teams and modern military forces draw inspiration from these tactics. But Spartan discipline wasn't just built on the battlefield. It permeated every aspect of their lives. From childhood, they learned to follow orders without question and to blindly trust their companions. It sounds rigid, right? But it was precisely this cohesion that made impossible feats possible. We can even draw a parallel with any difficult project in life. When everyone rows together, even the impossible becomes closer. And it was precisely this iron gear, forged over generations, that Leonidas took to Thermopylae. He knew he wouldn't win by quantity, but by the quality of each move. And as you'll see, this would turn the first days of battle into a veritable bloodbath for the Persians. When Leonidas and his 300 warriors arrived at Thermopylae, the scene seemed straight out of an epic. The narrow gorge, with mountains on one side and the sea on the other, was the perfect place to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. Xerxes brought with him hundreds of thousands of soldiers, an overwhelming force, but for the Spartans, it was nothing more than another challenge to be overcome with strategy and courage. In the first days of combat, the scene was brutal. The Spartan phalanxes massacred wave after wave of Persian soldiers, maintaining their impenetrable formation. Accounts tell of the Persians being driven into the sea, trampled by their own comrades, and killed mercilessly. It's impressive to imagine how a handful of men united by discipline managed to humble the greatest empire of the time. It was like watching David slay Goliath, only over and over again. This feat had a devastating psychological effect. Each victory bolstered Greek morale, while simultaneously eroding Persian confidence. To this day, leaders and strategists study this episode to understand how small forces can defeat giants when they know how to use their resources wisely, and herein lies the lesson. In any challenge in life, strategy and focus can be worth far more than brute force. But as you'll soon realize, not every glorious story lasts forever. As incredible as that resistance was, fate still had a bitter twist in store, and a betrayal that would cruelly change everything. Thermopylae was not just a battlefield, but a stage of brutality. The Spartans showed no mercy to their wounded enemies. If a Persian fell, they were finished off without hesitation. For them, giving a truce meant giving the enemy a chance to rise and fight again. It was kill or be killed, and this ruthless mentality was reflected in every blow, in every advance of the phalanx. Furthermore, there was something even more impressive: the way Leonidas and his warriors dealt with deserters or traitors. There was no forgiveness. If any Greek showed cowardice, punishment was immediate and lethal. This rigid sense of honor created a climate in which the only acceptable option was to fight to the end. It may seem extreme, but this is what made the soldiers fight as if each battle were their last, and for many it was. Accounts speak of bodies piling up, blood running across the field, and screams echoing off the mountains. It was a spectacle of war that shocked even the Persians. Xerxes himself, who had expected an easy massacre, began to realize he was facing something far greater than mere soldiers. It was as if these men carried a strength beyond life, a conviction impossible to break. But like every epic story, fate had a bitter twist in store. Because as strong as Spartan discipline was, it was about to be tested in an unexpected and cruel way, something that would completely change the course of the battle. At the height of Spartan resistance, the missing piece that changed the game appeared: Ephialtes, a Greek driven by ambition and the promise of Persian rewards. He knew a secret path through the mountains, a shortcut that would allow the Persians to surround Leonidas and his men. It's curious how, in many stories, the greatest threat comes not from the declared enemy, but from those within their own homes. And that's exactly what happened there. Ephialtes sold his own people for an empty promise of power and wealth. It's that old saying, every empire can be overthrown from without, but it's betrayal from within that causes the deepest wounds. For Xerxes, it was like being handed the key to victory, and for Leonidas, it meant facing the harsh reality that the battle, hitherto evenly balanced, was about to become a massacre. When Leonidas learned of the betrayal, there was no despair. On the contrary, he made the most difficult decision of his life, releasing most of his allies so they could escape and live to fight another day. But the 300 Spartans remained, as did a small group of allies who refused to abandon them. It was as if everyone knew, in that instant, that they were about to write the final lines of their own history. And it was from this point on that the war took on an even more tragic tone. The siege was about to close, and Leonidas's final fight would show the world the depths of a leader's courage in the face of certain death. When Leonidas realized the siege was inevitable, he did something few leaders would have the courage to do. He released most of the Greek troops. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. He knew keeping them all there would be a waste of precious lives. Only the 300 Spartans and a small group of allies remained. They stayed because they chose honor over survival, an act that still resonates today as one of history's greatest symbols of loyalty. That night was different. Many say the warriors laughed, sang, and celebrated, as if they were going to a great banquet, not to death. For them, dying in combat was the greatest glory possible, the culmination of everything they had trained for since childhood. It was almost as if they had made peace with fate, accepting that their lives would be the price paid for the freedom of others. Dawn brought with it the final brutality. Surrounded on all sides, the Spartans fought to the last man, never retreating. It's hard to imagine such determination. Even when their weapons broke, they kept fighting with their hands, teeth, and anything else they could find. It was a resistance not only physical but spiritual, an eternal reminder that courage can be more powerful than any army. And of course, this final battle wouldn't be just another confrontation. It would transform Leonidas into a legend. But fate still had in store for him an end as cruel as it was heroic, something that would further cement the myth surrounding his name. Leonidas's end was as brutal as the life he led. In the heat of the battle, the Spartan king fought like a common soldier, without privileges, without hiding behind other people's shields. When he finally fell, surrounded by his enemies, his death was not only a military loss, it was a devastating psychological blow to everyone around him. For the Persians, however, it was the perfect opportunity to send a message of intimidation to the Greeks. Xerxes, overcome by rage and perhaps a need to reassert his power, ordered Leonidas's body beheaded and crucified. At the time, this was seen as one of the greatest possible humiliations for a warrior. If for the Spartans, dying in combat was an honor, having one's body desecrated in this way was the greatest dishonor. It was as if Xerxes wanted to forcibly erase the legacy of courage that this man had left. But ironically, the effect was the opposite. Instead of diminishing Leonidas, the act only enhanced his legend. The story of this king, who fought to the end, even in the face of an overwhelming enemy, spread like wildfire among the Greeks. His death became a symbol of resilience and inspiration for the battles to come. It's curious how, often, trying to destroy a figure can make them even more powerful. And so Leonidas's sacrifice became a call for freedom. But what came next would show that his struggle had not been in vain, and that the blood spilled there would forever change the course of Greek history. Leonidas's death did not end his story. On the contrary, it was the beginning of his immortality as a symbol of courage. The sacrifice at Thermopylae echoed throughout Greece, inflaming the spirit of the free people against the Persian Empire. What seemed like a devastating defeat became an inspiration for future Greek victories, especially at the Battle of Plataea, where the Persians would finally be defeated. Leonidas showed the world that courage doesn't mean the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. His example proved that sometimes it takes someone willing to pay the ultimate price to inspire the masses. It's like when a person in real life decides to face the impossible and ends up opening doors for others to follow the same path. Leaders like this don't live only for themselves. They become beacons for everyone around them. The Spartan legacy also served as a reminder of the power of discipline and unity. To this day, scholars of military strategy cite Thermopylae as an example of how small forces can have a gigantic impact when led with purpose and courage. In everyday life, this lesson is clear. Cohesive teams, united families, and societies working together can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. And that's precisely why Leonidas's figure remains alive, even so many centuries later. But there's something even more fascinating: how his brutality, combined with his leadership, shaped not only his fame, but also the very concept of heroism in the Western world. As time passed, Leonidas ceased to be just a king and became a legend. His story was told and retold for generations, taking on almost supernatural overtones. In Sparta, his name became synonymous with honor and courage, as if it were the standard every warrior should achieve. And outside Sparta, he came to be seen as an example of what it means to fight for something greater than one's own life. Leonidas's myth grew because he represented the ideal of a leader who not only commands but leads by example. He's the kind of figure who makes people believe in the impossible, even when all seems lost. Just as heroes in modern stories inspire millions, Leonidas inspired through the strength of his extreme resolve. It's interesting to think how figures like these transcend time, almost as if they were archetypes of humanity itself. Furthermore, his story has served as a political and military inspiration for centuries. Many leaders, in times of crisis, have evoked the spirit of Thermopylae to motivate their armies. It's as if Leonidas's figure is a constant reminder that the bravery of a few can change the fate of many. Even in today's pop culture, his myth appears in films, comics, and books, demonstrating that some names are never forgotten. And it is precisely at this point that we realize the myth of Leonidas is greater than his own life. But to understand how he also used brutality as a strategy, and not just brute force, we need to go a step further in history. Leonidas's brutality was never gratuitous. It was, in fact, part of his strategy. He understood that to face a colossal enemy, it was necessary to inflict a psychological impact on both allies and adversaries. Every action at Thermopylae had a purpose: to inspire the Greeks to keep fighting while simultaneously terrifying the Persians, demonstrating that not even death could break Spartan resolve. This form of leadership is very reminiscent of the difficult decisions we sometimes have to make in real life. There are times when being brutal or firm is the only way to show strength and ensure others move forward. Leaders in businesses, families, and even sports know that, at times, extreme examples are what determine whether everyone will continue or give up. Leonidas did this masterfully, paying the ultimate price to prove his point. Interestingly, it was precisely this strategic brutality that transformed their defeat into a historic victory. The sacrifice of the 300 showed the world that freedom had a price, but also that courage and discipline could be powerful weapons against any tyranny. To this day, this episode is remembered as one of humanity's greatest displays of leadership and collective sacrifice. And so Leonidas' story ends, but his legacy lives on. He not only inspired future victories, but also redefined what it means to be a true leader. Now that you know about this epic journey, it's impossible not to reflect. Do we, deep down, also possess some of this brutal courage to face our own giants? Now that you know the true story behind Leonidas' brutality, the question remains, what would you do if you had to face your own Persian army in life? It might not be a literal war, but it could be that seemingly impossible challenge, changing careers, starting a business, making a decision everyone else thinks is crazy. It's in these moments that we realize how much courage and discipline can transform destinies. Leonidas teaches us that true leadership requires sacrifice, and that it's often necessary to do what no one else has the courage to do. So, I ask you, what have you been putting off out of fear? What battles do you need to start fighting, even if the outcome seems uncertain? Sometimes the only thing that separates you from victory is the decision to take the first step. Now I want to hear from you, what part of this story resonated with you the most? Would you have the courage to do what Leonidas did? Comment below, because I love reading your opinions, and it also helps spark incredible discussions about history, leadership, and strategy. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and like it, because there's much more content like this coming. If you've made it this far, it's because you enjoy stories that truly teach. So let's join you on this journey of learning and inspiration.